It was, by any standards, an absolutely devastating statement.
She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions.
Clearly livid, Prince William let rip at the BBC tonight over the revelations surrounding his mother's Panorama interview. It was an intensely personal statement that made clear the depth of his hurt.
It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others.
And a short time ago, Prince Harry went even further. Our mother, he said, lost her life because of this kind of behaviour. Also on News at 10 tonight. A ceasefire in Israel and Gaza is due to begin within hours. A rapid rise in the number of cases of the Indian variant, but overall cases are flat and deaths down on this time last week.
How many of them maybe have had a vaccination?
Why India, the world's biggest vaccine producer, could take years to inoculate its people. Roads may not fall. An inquiry says the statue of Cecil Rhodes should come down. The Oxford College says it is not so sure. It is Glastonbury, but not as we know it. We have a sneak preview of this year's virtual event.
I've always liked playing to cows. I find cows a very sympathetic audience.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. If Martin Bashir's interview with Princess Diana back in 1995 was BBC journalism's greatest scoop, today it became the cause of its deepest crisis. The findings of an inquiry into how Mr Bashir secured the interview and into the cover-up the following year were devastating enough, but they were nothing to what Prince William has said tonight. He blamed the interview for making his parents' relationship worse and for fueling the isolation and paranoia he remembers from his mother's final years. That, the Prince said, had caused him indescribable sadness. But he reserved his most bitter criticism for the cover-up. He accused bosses at the BBC of looking the other way rather than asking tough questions. It had established a false narrative which, as the Prince put it, has been commercialised by the BBC for more than a quarter of a century. In his statement, Prince Harry didn't mention the BBC by name, but said a culture of exploitation and unethical practices ultimately took his mother's life. Funnily enough, neither of the two men who were the target of the report's criticism work at the BBC anymore. Former Director General Lord Hall left last August. Ironically, on the anniversary of the Princess's death, Mr Bashir left last Friday on health grounds, the BBC said. Many of us remember that interview, of course. History records its consequences. Diana and Charles divorced. The Princess lost her HRH title, her security, and then her life in a Parisian underpass.
It was the 1995 interview we all remember, which shook the royal family and had consequences far greater than the BBC could have imagined.
Do you think Mrs. Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were three of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
But tonight, the consequences for the BBC are significant and serious. Today, an investigation by former Judge Lord Dyson concluded the BBC had been deceitful in how it secured its world exclusive with Princess Diana. And tonight, her son Prince William reacted, and he didn't hold back.
It is welcomed that the BBC accepts Lord Dyson's findings in full, which are extremely concerning. That BBC employees lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia, displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others.
And a reaction tonight from Prince Harry, who said media practices such as this killed his mother. He said, "Our mother lost her life because of this and nothing has changed. By protecting her legacy, we protect everyone and uphold the dignity with which she lived her life. Let's remember who she was and what she stood for." Prince William was 13 when his mother gave that interview. He was 15 when she died less than 2 years later. He spoke today of how the Panorama interview affected the final years he spent with her.
It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions.
The tough questions Prince William said were not asked relate to the internal inquiry in 1996 by this man, Tony Hall, now Lord Hall, the former Director General. Today's report found his investigation was flawed, and the BBC's current Director General had to apologise.
We've offered a full apology to those that have been affected.
Is it your view that there are some criminal investigations which are warranted as a result of what Lord Dyson has found?
Well, as you'd expect, I can't judge that. That has to be a matter for the police to look at what is available in Lord Dyson's
But you're willing
report.
to admit that forgery has been committed here in order
Indeed,
to deceive Princess Diana?
The documents were faked, forged. I can only be driven by what is in the Dyson report. That clearly demonstrates major BBC failings, which, I think it is a dark day for the BBC.
The former judge was called in to investigate what Panorama's reporter Martin Bashir had done to secure the Diana interview. The report concluded he deceived Diana's brother Earl Spencer. He forged bank statements to claim Earl Spencer's staff were being paid for leaking stories. Mr. Bashir used them to get a meeting. Today's report did publish a handwritten note from Princess Diana herself. In December 1995, she wrote that she consented to the interview and had no regrets. Martin Bashir, who's now left his job as the BBC's religion editor on health grounds, said today he did regret forging the bank statements. It was, he said, a stupid thing to do and was an action I deeply regret. But the bank statements had no bearing whatsoever on the personal choice by Princess Diana to take part in the interview. But that interview, said Diana's oldest son tonight, should never be aired again.
It is my firm view that this Panorama programme holds no legitimacy and should never be aired again.
The BBC says it commissioned this inquiry because it wanted to uncover the truth. It cannot be surprised then by the reaction tonight from Diana's two sons.
And Chris is here to talk about all this. Look, what's so devastating about the statement, particularly from Prince William tonight, but actually from both princes, is that essentially he's saying that it wasn't just that this was dishonestly obtained, but the way it was obtained actually changed the course of history, in essence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as big as that. I mean, look, I spoke to the BBC Director General this afternoon, but before Prince William and Prince Harry made their statements tonight, and he told me then it was a dark day for the BBC. I think it's got significantly darker tonight. If you read the long statement that Prince William gave this evening, but also the one from Prince Harry as well, both sons, they stopped just short of saying that this interview caused their mother's death. But if you listen to what their uncle, Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, has been saying quite forcefully now, that there is a link, you can draw the link between the interview in 1995 and her death 2 years later in 1997. Why does he say that? Because he says that interview set in motion a train of events, the divorce, losing her HRH title, losing her publicly funded security, that essentially meant that she ended up in that Paris tunnel in a car with a driver who was drunk. Now, I mean, these allegations could not be more serious. And, the BBC commissioned this report because they wanted to get to the truth. I think the truth for them is very, very ugly indeed.
OK, Chris, no doubt there'll be more on that tomorrow. But for now, thank you very much indeed. It feels like only last night that we were asking how worried we should be about the Indian strain of coronavirus. In fact, it was last night, yet in those 24 hours, new figures have shown how fast case numbers are rising. In Bolton, for example, they've doubled in 5 days, faster than in the run-up to the January peak. Not for the first time in the pandemic, then, there is a difference of opinion between some scientists and the government. The Prime Minister thinks we are still on track for the ending of restrictions on June the 21st.
Are we still on track for the 21st of June, Prime Minister?
Let's see, we hope so.
He hopes so, and so do we. The Prime Minister, like the rest of us, wants some sort of normality next month. But the biggest threat to that at the moment comes from the so-called Indian variant, which is spreading rapidly in some parts of the country. But why then are senior figures in government still optimistic that they'll reach their target of lifting the majority of restrictions by June 21st?
Well, we're getting new data through all the time, and one of the things which is, I think, encouraging is that the existing vaccines that we have are dealing with things like the specific Indian variant that's caused us a problem. But they only work if people take the vaccines. So the most important thing now is for everyone who's offered a vaccine to get the vaccine.
But scientists are worried. Last week, cases of the Indian variant stood at 1,313. But since then, they've risen by more than 160%, now at 3,424. The experts say it's too early to know for sure what the exact impact of this variant is.
If you think we're in a race to immunise our population with the virus, but we can't go much faster because of supply constraints, but if the virus can transmit faster, then of course it can affect many more people quicker.
Today it emerged that a software failure in the test and trace system meant that 8 local authorities in England did not have access to all the data they needed, including here in Blackburn and Darwin, where there has been a surge of cases of the Indian variant. The glitch meant that some who tested positive were not informed promptly, allowing them to potentially spread the virus.
It's absolutely disgraceful. If people are not contacted to say that they've got a positive test, and they're sort of spreading the virus around, unknowingly spreading the virus around, then that's the government's fault.
The exact implications of this remains unknown, but the government will hope it can continue on with its roadmap out of the pandemic without any disruption. Shihab Khan, News at 10.
And this feels like a very good moment to be discussing it all with Tom. Look, I think we're all getting a little bit jaded about variant fears by now. We've had quite a lot of them this year, and they often come and then they dissipate. How worried should we be about this one?
I think the most honest answer to that is we just don't know. Talking to the scientists who are studying it, and this is, I think, why the Prime Minister and others are allowed to say, we think things are just on track. They just haven't got a clear signal yet, and they're waiting for the data to emerge. And it's as simple as that. We need to know how much more transmissible is it, and how much will the vaccines be affected, if at all. The numbers, remember, are really small compared to where we've been. They're tiny. We're talking a couple of thousand cases this week compared to 40. We had a peak of 60,000 cases back in January, just to put it in perspective. But they're all heading right now in the wrong direction. The scientists who study it closely are more worried today than they were a couple of days ago, I think it's fair to say. So the jury's still very much out, and it's something that's still causing a lot of concern until those numbers either start to come down or tell us something else about how this virus is behaving. OK, Tom, thank you very much indeed. Now, in India, where that strain was first detected, 250,000 new cases are being recorded every day. Deaths are running at 4,500 a day. And if they're pinning their hopes on vaccinations, after all, they make millions of them there, they are in for a very long wait. One estimate, based on the current vaccination rate, predicts it will be September 2023 before even half the population has had both jabs. India's rate of vaccination is actually falling at a much faster rate than its cases. Just over a month ago, India was administering over 4 million doses. In recent days, that has almost halved to 1.4 million. And some of India's poorest aren't getting any jabs at all.
These are India's least fortunate. In Kolkata's slums, life is always perilous. During a pandemic, they feel abandoned. 1.5 million people live in squalor. This slum was built beside the main sewage outlet from the port. With an acute shortage of vaccinations across one of the most densely populated nations on earth, They come at the end of the queue.
Just the people around here, how many of them maybe have had a vaccination?
Anybody आप लोग कोई वैक्सीन लिया? कोई नहीं लिया. कोई लिया? Anybody has taken vaccination? In this area, almost here, not a single person will get who has got vaccinated.
It's only possible to book an appointment using the government-approved website. Soni Khatun tries to show her mother.
She can't write or she can't read, so she can't do. Not just my mom, there are many women which can't do and can't use smartphone.
Getting the vaccine into packed and poverty-ridden sections of Indian society is going to be difficult and time-consuming.
The Indian government's ambition is to try and vaccinate the majority of people in the next 3 or 4 months. But here in the slums, well, it's unrealistic. Community leaders tell us it's more likely to take several years.
Older patients were receiving a second dose at a nearby centre. Anyone over 18 should be able to come here, but shortages mean there's been an instruction across Kolkata to stop first doses for younger people.
First dose हम लोगों का 28 से बंद हो गया.
After the 28th of April, we stopped giving first doses, the manager explained. We don't know when it'll restart until we're told by the authorities.
हम लोग संग announcement कर देंगे.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi pressed ahead with election rallies last month. Now he's rarely seen after criticism that his government failed to order enough vaccines, instead selling or donating them abroad.
At no point was a decision taken that we would compromise national health.
The vice president of Modi's BJP party defended their actions.
India was selling, but it wasn't looking after its huge home population, which was probably the priority.
India was not just selling, India was also donating vaccines. In hindsight, it's easy to make this kind of analysis. You turn the clock back 5 months, however, and it seemed that we would not have this kind of critical requirement of vaccines, and that we could take 6 months to roll out our vaccines.
Celebrations for a wedding are underway in the village of Bantari. The limited stocks of vaccine available in rural Uttar Pradesh means most of the people at this ceremony will struggle to get a jab.
अगर गांव में वैक्सीन अगर ज़्यादा अगर उपलब्ध हो जाए अगर मिलता तो सब लोग लगवा लेते क्योंकि अवेलेबल नहीं हो पा रहा है यहाँ क्योंकि गरीब हम वहाँ कितने लोगों को तो जाने के लिए भाड़ा भी तक नहीं है.
Protecting those on the wrong side of the wealth divide, both in cities and in rural states, may not be a priority. But it is the only way to stop the emergence of new variants. Juliet Bremner, News at 10, Kolkata.
After 11 days of destruction and death, Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas have tonight agreed a ceasefire. It is due to come into effect at 2 a.m. local time, midnight tonight UK time. It has been touch and go all day. Israel's Security Cabinet took the decision this evening. Hamas says it is a defeat for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His office tonight talked of the operation's significant achievements.
Gaza tonight, no sign of a truce. But despite the ball of smoke and flames, a ceasefire does appear to be close. Israel appears to have responded to pressure from the US and others. No comment from its Prime Minister tonight. A senior source told ITV News that silence would be met with silence. A statement from his Security Cabinet agreed to accept the Egyptian initiative for a mutual ceasefire without preconditions to take effect at a time to be determined. And it noted what it called Israel's significant achievements in the operation, some of which are unprecedented. All day, the 11th of this conflict, airstrikes by Israel have continued, and rockets were fired by Hamas. But the hope is that this is the storm before the quiet. As Egyptian negotiators tried to mediate in the Middle East, at the UN today there was pressure on both sides to agree.
The fighting must stop immediately.
I appeal to all parties to cease hostilities now.
Around the same time, German, Czech and Slovakian ministers visited Israel. Its government, though under pressure, was not alone. But both sides in the conflict were reluctant to be seen to be giving in to the other or to external pressure. Inside Gaza today, as rockets fired overhead towards Israel, ITV News joined ambulance workers as they raced through the ruined streets. With them was a young girl almost silenced by her injuries. Her mother overwhelmed by fear. Inside the hospital, she received treatment, injuries from artillery fire. And she was not the only one here. A British doctor working in Gaza said the UK government should do more to encourage restraint for the sake of the youngest victims.
Almost a third of all of the wounded that I'm seeing now are children. And unfortunately, most of them will be left with lifelong disabilities as a result of these injuries.
As we saw this week, a pan-Palestinian movement against Israel appears to have been galvanized, just as the infrastructure of Hamas was hammered and as civilians died on both sides. This might have been a conflict where all sides lost.
And Rohit joins me now from Tel Aviv. Rohit, do you think this does draw a line under the past 11 days of conflict?
No, Tom, no, it doesn't, because after this heavy human cost on both sides, and particularly in Gaza, you know, the question now is, firstly, what happens between now and that ceasefire, which comes in at midnight? Hamas has said it leaves on the table that the right to send in a final barrage of rockets. But what happens after that? Does the ceasefire hold? And very few people have much hope. You know, there are regional implications. Hamas is a proxy of Iran, and there are implications for the Israeli government at home. There is communal violence. We've seen riots. We've seen violence between Jewish and Arab Israelis as well. And around the world, we have seen this big rise in anti-Semitism in countries right across the world. So many people believe that Benjamin Netanyahu had a political motive for pursuing this military operation, trying to solidify his support on Israel's right wing and surveying the damage and now looking into the future. Many people here are really wondering, was this really worth it?
OK, Rohit, thank you very much. Now back here, anyone who saw the first of our reports by Daniel Hewitt on flats blighted by damp won't be surprised to know the social housing regulator has taken Croydon Council to task for what we filmed there. Daniel and his team found tower block tenants living in misery, to put it mildly, surrounded by mould. The regulator found the council had seriously breached social housing standards. It wants council leaders to take full responsibility and start making the flats safer. The police have given a glimpse into what they are digging below the Gloucester cafe where a suspected victim of the serial killer Fred West may be buried. They have released the video pictures filmed yesterday by the documentary crew who first alerted police that there might be something, or the remains of someone rather, down there. They think they may be those of 15-year-old Mary Baston, who worked at the cafe. At the height of the Black Lives Matter protest last summer, the chant "Rhodes must fall" echoed through the streets of Oxford. There is a statue of Cecil Rhodes, an imperialist, racist and uncomfortably benefactor of Oriel College. The college itself was happy to take it down, but ordered an inquiry anyway. That inquiry has now agreed it should be removed, and yet the college is suddenly saying, not so fast, it's staying put.
The Oxford College where he stands said it wanted rid of him. It even commissioned an inquiry into how it might be done. And yet Cecil Rhodes, the arch-imperialist, is still there.
I'm confused. The college doesn't want to have the statue anymore. The commission found that it shouldn't be there either. And yet it's staying. Why?
It's an incredibly complex issue. The governing body would like the statue to come down. And what we determined by looking at all the evidence was that in the current regulatory, political, planning environment, we would have almost no chance of success.
Cecil Rhodes was a businessman and a politician who made his career and his fortune in southern Africa in the days of the British Empire. To his detractors, though, he was a white supremacist. And for the protesters who spent years demanding that the statue must fall, planning battles are not a good enough reason not to take it down.
It just seems to me to be a really unprincipled and frankly quite cowardly way of simply reacting to whatever the extant pressures might be.
Dealing with the legacy of Cecil Rhodes in Oxford is very difficult, not least because it continues to be very beneficial. Every year, the Rhodes Trust, which is based in that building over the road, pays for 100 students from across the world to come and study at the university. And as its website will tell you, 20% of Rhodes scholars currently in residence are people of colour.
Rhodes' contribution to this university was immense, but for at least one of his scholars, he's not remembered properly here.
We're talking about a colonial administrator. We're talking about someone who built his wealth out of the diamond mines of South Africa. We're talking about someone who created his own colony so that he could paint the map of Africa red, British red, created his own colony called Rhodesia. So the reality of the person that we're talking about, that conversation is not being had when we're just saying the Rhodes Scholarship or the beautiful marble statue at Oriel. The history is not actually being reckoned with.
So Rhodes will not fall for the foreseeable future, and he looks down on a university still grappling with what his past says about our present. Geraint Vincent, News at 10, Oxford.
Finally, if music fans can't go to the traditional Glastonbury Festival this summer again, then Glastonbury is coming to them. Down on the farm in Somerset, where it is normally staged, they are getting ready for virtual Glastonbury this weekend. Sounds a lot less fun. The fields on the farm won't be totally deserted, though. As singer Damon Albarn of Blur fame put it, I find cows a very, very sympathetic audience.
With no fans allowed on site, access to this event is limited only to those who live here. Right now, Worthy Farm looks and feels like a farm, but dotted across this vast site, there are pockets of activity, suggesting something else is going on. A sound check for Idols inside a farmyard barn. Coldplay get the pyramid stage in front of it, not on it. This is a one-day online Glastonbury festival without fans but with stars.
Glastonbury, how you feeling?
It could not be more different than the normal 200,000 people pitching their tents and living for 4 days in a temporary town. When asked if he was up for an empty event, the decision for Blur and Gorillaz frontman Damon Albarn was easy.
I went like that. I jumped for joy, really. I mean, I love this place. I've been coming here since the first time I played, it was 1990, I think. I've done so many different things here.
He's glad to be back, but conscious that his position is far removed from most in the industry, who are suffering from the double impact of COVID and Brexit.
All the visas that everyone's going to have, it's not going to be as simple just getting on the train and going over to Europe anymore, which is kind of catastrophic for the arts.
Filling the fields with fans is what everyone really wants, and with a licence for a one-day event in September granted, organisers are hopeful.
Young people who've missed out on 2 years of gigs and festivals, everybody's going to just be desperate to get back out into the fields and to dance.
Until then, it's music for the dairy herd, which supposedly increases production. Damon Albarn is happy with that.
Yeah, I've always liked playing to cows. I find cows a very sympathetic audience. I mean, that's what we could do. You know, we could, as musicians, we could improve the milk yield for our herds. In the absence of anything else, we could do that.
Is that the headline?
Well, okay. Well, why not?
Saturday's online event goes some way to making up for another fallow year at the festival. Hopefully the sun will rise again in 2022, warming the crowds rather than the cows. Rupert Evelyn, News at 10, Somerset.
Cows are a very sympathetic audience. That has to be the most 2021 comment yet. Please, Lord, let life get back to normal soon. Night, night.